Hi, everybody. Welcome in to the HTX Chop Shop. We are here to talk about the Houston Cougs, your hometown basketball team. And I am joined by my good friend, Bryce. We podcast together. How are you doing, Bryce?
I'm great as always. Excited to talk about my second favorite Cougars in the country. But they're my number two team. So both my favorite teams are happen to be named the Cougs. So I'll take it.
Yeah, and this one has the better spelling with Coogs, and there's no stupid U in there. But we're gonna start kind of with the season, what happened at the end, what happened with the tournament, and then we'll move down and we're gonna talk about the off season, all that good stuff. So we'll just jump right in. The Cougs had a really good season, for the most part, having a pretty strong record, only losing 4 games all year, if I recall correctly. One of the best defenses in the country, played great all year, and just kind of faltered down the stretch, and especially come tournament time against NKU and Miami, really, really struggled. They had some injury issues with Shed and Sasser, and some of the other guys were banged up, including Jawan. And you could tell in those first 2 games that they weren't really themselves, but they were able to pull it off. Was there anything in those first 2 games that really stood out to you, Bryce, about that, about the Cougs?
It really felt like watching that Auburn game. So I picked them to win the championship, right? They were my go-to championship team. And watching that Auburn game, I was like, I probably made a mistake. They just did not look like a championship team in that game. They won, and it was great, and it was great to see, my boy Tramon go off, and I thought, Jarace had a very nice game, but it really felt like watching that game that the offense just wasn't there. The defense was fine. The defense, as expected, is fine, but I felt like the offense just really lacked cohesion. I think this is one of those times where it really stood out to me, just the lack of spacing on this team. I think Shead is like a very good passer, but it looks like this team has no passers because he doesn't have anyone to throw it to. I don't think Kelvin Sampson's like a bad offensive coach by any means. That's not what I'm trying to say. I just think this team was really spacing deficient in a way that's just tough to overcome. And they were very reliant on individual players giving Herculean offensive efforts. And at a certain point, that's an issue when you're playing other really good defenses. So it just kind of came down to me not trusting their offense. And then they went to play one of the more explosive defenses or one of the more explosive offenses in Miami. And, Miami's not a great defense, but they do have the type of personnel who will just make you beat them one-on-one. And Houston couldn't do it. Houston just could not consistently beat Miami one-on-one.
Yeah, and they really kind of almost showed their ass with the hard hedge, because especially Nigel Pack. I mean, he was the story of the night, shooting like 70% from 3. But also, even if he wasn't hitting all those shots, he still got to open jumpers basically at will. Because you can see every single time they set the high pick and roll, you can see the big come up, and it is the most easy to see, easy to read thing ever. And they reject the screen and get right into open space, right to the rim. And it just happened over and over again. The Cougs had never, there just aren't really teams like that in the AAC, that can take advantage like that. And there aren't players like Nigel Pack. Sure, Kendrick Davis, but Kendrick Davis isn't the level of screen navigator, and Jamal Shed had him in hell every single time he was healthy and they played, right? DeAndre Williams isn't that level of screener. They also just got killed on the boards. They losing to Norchad, Omier, and what's his name, Miller. Yeah. And they just got destroyed on the boards, and that's not something you can do when so much of your identity as a program is built on that. And then, shit goes to hell. Miami goes on, beats Texas too, so we don't feel too bad, but proceeds to lose to UConn. Would have been nice to lose to the eventual champion, but, this was a really strong year for the Cougs. Expected a little better. I had them winning it all too. I'm a little bit biased, but, sadly, there are quite a few Cougs who will be leaving in different ways, whether that is going to the NBA or hitting the transfer portal, or maybe not pursuing basketball in their future very much longer. But we'll jump right into that. So the first guy, the star of the year, the Cougs legend, Marcus Sasser, probably like 6'2", electric shooter, going to go out to the draft this year. Bryce, what do you think his draft range looks like after this weird of a season in his kind of weird career?
So Sasser's someone that I've really liked for a long time. Obviously, now he's at a point where he's a little older, and that always worries you. And he's also he does fall in that more combo than a point guard. Though I will say, I think some of that combo stuff was just they had a better point guard in Shed, and they didn't need him to be that much of a playmaker. But he still was a good passer during his senior year, playing mostly off the ball. I where he will land is probably, more I would guess he probably goes undrafted. Maybe he gets mid-second round, but honestly, going at undrafted is probably better than being the 50th pick anymore. Until that kind of second round allotment money with the new CBA kicks in. But I think for me, I would have him probably top near the top of my second round. I actually prefer him to some of the other point guard prospects. Guys I would have him in a realm close to guys like Terquavion Smith and Judah Mintz. I think he's a far better defender than those two, a much better passer than both of those guys. So I'll take that. I do have my worries with him. Can he consistently get downhill? What does he look like, in isolation possessions against NBA caliber defenders? But what I do like is that I think he's a solid pick and roll operator. And also he's a good enough shooter and defender that he can kind of fill into that off ball type point guard that we see, pretty common in the NBA now. I would definitely, lean towards him being, I think he has a higher percentage chance to be a valuable starter than guys like Judah Mintz and Turk, just because I think that being able to shoot and defend is better than the slightly higher upside of being an uber athlete who gets to the rim all the time. Now, obviously, there's some benefit to that first, to take that higher upside swing with guys like Turk and Judah, but Sasser just feels safer to me. I think he's going to stick in the NBA. It's not like a Armani Brooks or even, as much as I loved him, Nate Hinton, those guys were kind of much more fringy. Sasser, to me at least, and maybe this isn't the consensus, I don't know, but I've said this since his sophomore year. He just seems like an NBA player to me. He's just someone who I think is going to stick around. Seems like a good locker room guy. He can, really shoot the cover off the ball when he's hot. He can create for himself a little bit. Runs a nice pick and roll defense. Does everything you want from that sort of backup kind of fifth starter point guard type guy.
Yeah, and I think his shot versatility kind of gives him there's going to be a role on him, right? I don't think there's a team you can look at in the NBA and be oh yeah, I don't really see how Marcus Sasser fits here. I think he can play different roles. He can defend a little bit up the lineup. I think he can defend smaller wings, even 6'5" skinny wings at the NBA. I think he's just tough. It sucks because last year we talked about, we'd take him late first just because of how weird the draft was. And now he's a little bit older. He's probably going to slip into that second and, even undrafted, like you said. But I agree with you. I think he's just an NBA player, and it's kind of blatantly obvious. He just does he does NBA player stuff, and you if you can find a guy like that at any point in the draft, then why not? Especially one who there's a real chance he's a playoff rotation player for certain teams someday, and I really buy that with him. Moving on to the next person who will be leaving, the other big name from this Cougs team, Jairus Walker, are the highest ranked freshman in Cougs history. Hakeem doesn't count because recruiting rankings weren't a thing when he showed up, but he usurped Daniel House, so I have him to forever thank for that. He's currently at Tankathon has him at 6th on their board, and in that 5 to 10 range on a lot of other boards. Where do you think he's going to go? What do you think his range is? And what do you think the best fit is for Jarace at the next level?
So I'll start, I suppose, by talking about like what his range is, because it seems like it's as high as 5, maybe even 4, because one, and this will be a topic of discussion more for a later day, but it seems like general valuators just way over indexed for college basketball, and this has always been a thing. It's the reason a guy like Luka fell to 3. If Luka played in college, he would have been the number 1 overall pick by, every metric, everything would have been like, oh, he's the obvious number 1 pick, but because he played overseas, college players tend to get I would say slightly overrated sometimes, and that could lead to Jarace going over, the OTE guys, and probably not Scoot, but maybe even Scoot, like depending on, the way things will seem like they're trending right now. I think for me, Walker, his fit is interesting, especially when kind of looking at those teams in that area, because I've said this before, but I think he's a 5. I would want him to go to a team where he can play as the 5, because that's his optimal role long term. I think he's honestly even like a drop 5, not even like a switch 5, like an Isaiah Stewart or something. Like he's a drop 5. His lateral quickness is not good enough for him to consistently guard on the perimeter, but he does have great hands and good length. So if you could find a spot where he could play as a 5, all of a sudden there's some intrigue there. I think Charlotte would be a great fit. Obviously, LaMelo Ball, play up tempo a little bit, something he hasn't done because Houston likes to play at a deliberate pace, but I think he absolutely could do, even though I think he's kind of slow. San Antonio would be a great fit because they just need anyone who's competent, and that team specifically could really use his passing, which I think is his best skill. Use him in the short role, try and have him be a playmaker for kind of their off-ball scorers like Kelvin Johnson, Devin Vassell. Indiana would be great, though. Obviously, Miles Turner maybe is going to be there. But teams I would hope he doesn't go to. Orlando, I think, would be an awful fit. Utah, I think, would be a really bad fit. Oklahoma City is like a toss-up. They just have so many mouths to feed that I don't, this will sound like blasphemy to some, but is he really better than Jalen Williams? I don't know. I like Jalen Williams. This is Arkansas Jay Jalen Williams, not J-Dub.
It's not Auburn, Jay. It's not the one in this draft class that OKC may end up drafting just for shits and gigs.
Just to ruin my brain. So I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying I want to go to a place where he can be a 5 and where he plays with someone who can help to leverage his passing, because that generally means spacing, and that generally means teams that are sort of passing deficient. Portland right now is the 5th best odds, right? He could be great in Portland, backing up Yusuf Nurkic and then eventually taking over for him, because they like to run a lot of sets where Nurkic is used as a playmaker because he's a very good passer. I think Jarace could absolutely run those same sets and be more reliable to take a tween hezzy mid-range jumper. I guess that's where I'm at. I want him to go to a spot where he's a 5 and where he plays in enough spacing or plays under a coach that uses actions that will allow him to maximize his playmaking.
So what I'm hearing is he needs to come to the Rockets when Kenny Atkinson is the coach, and then Şengün, who got sent to the bench. Sorry, I can't say that on this channel.
He's just the worst Usman Garuba.
You can't say that on this channel. You can't say that. Jarace is great. I love Jarace more than I like him as a prospect, honestly. Still probably going to end up being near a lottery guy for me. I think he'll probably end up being a bit overvalued. I think his defense is a bit overrated. Love him to death. One of my favorite players. Some of the floaters just piss me off, and it's gonna, we'll see where it goes, and I hope the best for him. Moving on to Tramon Mark, who entered the transfer portal, and we were going to talk about all the different spots where he could go and where we like him most ending up, but he ended the conversation early and decided to go to Arkansas, go play for Coach Eric Musselman. So Bryce, how do you feel about this transfer? How do you feel about how this, changes the Cougs team for next year? Losing someone who's such a consistent scorer and one of the best man defenders in all of college basketball.
I love Tramon Mark, and it's tough to see him leave. Like I've been on the Tramon Mark hype train since he was a senior in high school. I believe Coop and I were just kind of getting to know each other, and I'm like, he's someone to pay attention to. He's, a great defender who has one of the funkiest looking but most effective pull-up jumpers of anyone his size. The one thing I'll point to is it's great for my agenda that he's going to Arkansas because Arkansas just gets more NBA looks than Houston, even though Houston's better. It's just how it's going to go. That Arkansas team next year is loading again. I think Keon Menafield is great. He's going to help run the show there. Layden Blocker, also a star. Cleef Battle, whatever. Doesn't really move me. But sorry to all the Temple fans listening, I guess. Or maybe not sorry. I don't know. I feel like
they're happy. You're going to have to apologize after we talk about the next Temple guy a little bit later in the pod.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think it's great for him. It's great for his NBA upside, but it does suck for Houston because all of a sudden we talked about how reliant this offense is on guys who can create their own shot off the bounce. He was their best guy at that. Maybe, I mean, him or Sasser, obviously, but even Sasser was more of a needs a screen, come off a DHO. Tramon Mark is just a guy who just rises up and hits those shots all the time. And when he's hot, he's hot. And obviously, he had times where I'm sure it's frustrating as a Coug fan. Every once in a while, he'd probably have a game where he would go 1 of 7 from the mid range, and you just kind of have to live with it. But at a certain point, if that's what this offense needs, it's tough to lose that. And there's not really an obvious replacement on this roster. Obviously, we're going to talk about freshmen coming in. We're going to talk about transfers. I don't think any of them necessarily replace what Mark does. I don't think any of them can be both that level of point of attack defender and that level of pull-up shot maker. Plus, I think he was developing as a passer. Was he a great passer? No, not at all. But if you asked him to run more pick and roll, especially now with Sasser gone, probably stepping up into that secondary ball handler role, I think he could have done it. And I think he's going to do that at Arkansas. And, Coop, I know you like Ark, so it won't hurt so bad. But it's probably going to be harder for Houston fans because he's probably going to blossom there, I think. I think we'll talk about him as a all SEC type player, and just gonna have to live with that, I suppose. It sucks. It sucks for Houston to lose him.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite players. One of the first pods we did was with PD, and or when I joined, one of the first when I joined our podcast was with PD, and I talked about Tramon on that one. And Bryce and I have talked about Tramon for years, and it's hard. He's my little brother's favorite player, so it's hard from a lot of different standpoints. He's really good at basketball, and you're right. He's not going to get the same NBA looks here as you're going to get at Arkansas, right? People are going to be watching Bay Fall because he's a 5-star, and they're going to be watching because it's the SEC, and they're going to be watching any number. And even compared to the Big 12, the SEC just gets more eyes on it, and especially such an elite program like Arkansas. And it sucks. Absolutely love him, but he's going to thrive and he's going to make money there that I don't think he really had the opportunity to make here. So you can't really blame him for leaving. It's onto a much less sad note from a basketball standpoint. Reggie Chaney, the reigning AAC player of the year. In my notes is have fun in Europe, buddy. He's the 6'5" center who absolutely drove me nuts because he couldn't hit his free throws. He's the culture guy, which sucks. Always sucks to lose because that's such a big part of this UH program is, culture this, culture that. You're going to hear that anytime you hear about this Cougs team. And Reggie was a big part of that. But also, we went to him down the stretch against Alabama, and that was one of the worst days of my entire life. So I have mixed feelings, but at the end of the day, for basketball reasons, I'm not too beat up. Bryce, do you think he has any big basketball chances? What do you see for Reggie Chaney's future?
I have zero opinions on Reggie Chaney other than it's really funny watching Houston games with you, mostly because of him. But what I will say is that him leaving will open up minutes for better players. And again, like I get, he's culture, all that. JoJo Tugler and Javier Francis are both just better players who deserve his minutes, just straight up. Like, and I'm excited. I get why, you're a coach, you want to reward. Was he a fifth year? You want to reward the
Fourth
fifth
or
year
fifth
guy who's been there, whatever. I get it. And for a backup big, it matters less, right? Like, Javier Francis was not going to be so much better than him last year in the 12 minutes a game that Chaney played that it matters. But this year, when the rotation might have to shake up a little bit, it helps to have minutes freed up. And I think there's just better players lying in wait.
Yeah, even last year, he was a fifth-year senior. But even, Javier was, infinitely better than him, even though he fouled 40 times a game. So did Chaney. Let me pull up the exact numbers. But, 6.3 fouls committed per 40 for Chaney as compared to Javier, who was at 6.2. So, Javier was actually better at literally everything than Reggie, except for culture and being short. So I love Chaney. I have nothing but love. That's my uncle's favorite player. Every single time Reggie Chaney does everything, he calls me and goes, "That's the chain!" And it drives me crazy. And I'm going to miss him. Good luck to him. But, sometimes you got to make room for better players. And then the last person we'll talk about here in this segment is Jamal Shed, who's not necessarily leaving. He's just testing NBA waters. And so we'll see. He's keeping all of his eligibility open. Bryce, how big do you think the chances that he leaves and goes to the NBA? And, how do you feel about Jamal as an NBA prospect in general?
Well, I'll say first that I doubt he leaves. Just because there's probably more money for him in college basketball right now. I don't know how big Houston's NIL resources are. I honestly don't know. Obviously not gigantic because I bet that's part of why they lost Mark, but big enough if I were to guess that Shed will. I like Shed personally, not necessarily as an NBA player, but I'd love him on my G League team to run everything. I just think that, and there's probably you're playing a dangerous game when you compare anyone to Jose Alvarado, right? But he is the type of player who could get some positive Jose Alvarado comps and fool a team into giving him a somewhat real contract. I think there's something to be said for he can just run a pick and roll and get to the rim, make some plays. Again, he hasn't really played in a spread pick and roll scheme at all. He hasn't played with great roll men, but he's a good passer. He gets to the rim. He's hard-nosed on defense. I think he can probably shoot, not a great shooter, but, I think he can maybe get there. Again, I wouldn't probably draft him, at least not in this year's class. Next year, maybe, and that's why it's probably a good reason for him to come back, too, is because, if he has a huge year and is AAC player of the year, and takes Houston to a Final Four or something, all of a sudden maybe he can get drafted. But this year, I think it's pretty unlikely, and I think that I probably wouldn't take him, but he is somewhat interesting just as a point guard who does the right things.
Yeah, he kind of fits the mold exactly to me as a backup point guard who, if your main guy goes down, can run pick and rolls and do good stuff for you. Like you said, I think if he was in an actual spread pick and roll offense, we'd see how good of a passer he really is, but he still makes all these reads in a pretty poorly spaced floor, pretty low turnover guy compared to a lot. This year, a 30 assist rate basically and an 18.8 turnover rate. Just pretty stellar numbers there for somebody who's running all this pick and roll. And most of his stuff isn't live dribble. I could count on one hand the amount of live dribble turnovers that aren't him trying to throw interesting passes and just being pickpocketed. He's got a great handle. He's got a nice little floater, good touch. I buy the shot, but I think that's really what keeps him from being a draftable guy. And at the end of the day, I think this Coogs team desperately needs him to come back, honestly. you don't want to say stuff like that, like, oh, I really believe in all these guys, but at the end of the day, Shed's the engine, right? Shed was the entire reason why last year's Cougs team was able to go to the Elite Eight, why they were like a really good team and were able to beat Arizona, because he's a great point guard who can do the right thing. And I think he should get a taste of the NBA, but like, if Sharif Cooper isn't getting an NBA shot, I don't know how Jamal Shed is going to get one unless he's really able to shoot and like really lead this team somewhere great and like show that he's a leader and does all this stuff. And there has to be a lot more there than like Sharif is one of the most talented players I've ever seen. Like, yeah, that's a high bar, and he's stuck in the G League. So I really love Jamal. I hope he comes back for all the reasons you said. One of my favorite players ever. But we're going to move on. And Bryce, I will just hand the floor over to you to go over the incoming freshmen. You watch way more high school ball than I do. I have watched some of these guys, specifically Tugler, but the rest of them I don't have as much of an eye on. So what do you think of this recruiting class for the Cougs?
I think it's probably less fun than last year's. For those who don't know, I had my favorite Houston incoming freshman last year was not the one who's going to be a lottery pick this year. I thought their class last year was awesome, and I'm saying that as someone who was pretty low coming in on Jarace and is still fairly low on Jarace. Like, I thought that freshman class was incredible. This one is less star-studded, though I think it does have one truly excellent player in it, and that's no surprise to anyone, JoJo Tugler. Tugler is one of the best defensive prospects I've ever seen in my life. His mix of feel and help, length, athleticism, and just an insane motor. Like, he reminds me a lot of Tari Eason defensively, but stronger. Maybe that sounds crazy. He's listed at 6'7". He's probably more like 6'8". I guess he has like at least a 7-foot wingspan. He can probably play some 5, play some 4. There's offensive questions there. I think he can kind of pass. He's a good 2-foot athlete, not a great 2-foot athlete. The shot is a work in progress, but at a certain point, like a game-breaking defender playing for one of the best defensive coaches in college basketball history, it's pretty fun. It's pretty good, I think. So I'm all in on Tugler. Like, I absolutely think he is someone who should start right away. I don't know exactly, we'll talk about the starting lineup here in a little bit, but I would be doing everything I can to get him minutes and to make him, put him in a spot that works. Like, because I don't think you'll be able to match his defensive. A lot of people really loved like Jairus Walker defensively this year, right? And I think Tugler is that on steroids. Like, he's just better at all the stuff that Walker's good at defensively. And probably a little worse offensively, but at probably a manageable similarity. Again, I think he can be a good passer. The shot, if he can just hit like some wide open spot ups, like, I think there's something there. I'll move on to actually, do you have any thoughts on JoJo?
Like you said, the motor, just insane. Like, this dude is flying around, grabbing boards, swatting shots, just brings all the effort that you want, a Coug to bring. And he's going to bring all that and more. We'll see about him starting. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But, I mean, like you said, offensive questions, led an absolute machine. He gets beat a little bit, because he's a 6'8" big man, like in ISO. But I think that's kind of overblown by the fact that he's having to guard like 6'3" centers who are really, point guards at the next level and at high school. And at the college level, I think he's just going to be a beast and someone who you definitely want on your side coming into the new Big 12.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right there. I'll move on to Cordell or Kordelius. I don't know exactly what he likes to go by. I've seen it listed both ways. Kordelius Jefferson. This is like a 6'3" combo guard. He's just I think he's mostly just a shooter. Obviously, Kelvin Sampson's recruiting him. He's a good point of attack defender. I wouldn't say I've seen a ton of that in his game necessarily. But I'm guessing he can at least get there. Another Texas guy. This guy's from Arlington. Just a really talented shooter. Off the dribble, off some movement. I think, obviously like Quentin Grimes is like a high bar for any Houston shooter, but that type of Armani Brooks, Quentin Grimes' role is what you're looking for from Jefferson. And I think, in 3 to 4 years, he can fulfill that. I think he's a better shooter than like an Emmanuel Sharp, who, Sharp does other things. But I think in that type of role, he has a lot of upside long term. He has flashed some shot creation. I wouldn't say he's super athletic. I think he struggles to get to the rim, and he's really not very developed as a passer right now. But off the dribble shooting and can hit some off movement. Even at 6'3", that's a good college player. That's someone who, if you can hold on to him for 4 years by their senior year, is going to bring a lot of value to the program. So I'm pretty in on him there. Again, I haven't seen like a ton of him. And from what I have seen, like the defense hasn't really popped, but I'm sure long term it'll work out. Jacob McFarland, 6'10", big. He is an interesting get to me because I don't really see him as like a traditional UH big. He doesn't seem like someone who is going to get out on the floor and hard hedge a ton. He's someone who in the games I've watched does a lot of standing in the paint, has very long arms, can get pretty high off the ground for some blocks, has very nice touch with like a little right-handed hook shot, but doesn't really pop to me as someone who is going to excel in this specific defensive scheme. But you and I kind of talked in the pre-show a little bit and how you think they might be going away from that. So do you want to kind of, let me know like what you think of that and how you think McFarland might fit in that?
So I think, especially with like Fabian White leaving and guys like that, and seeing how the Miami game went, I think that we've seen that the hedge, especially exclusively hedging, is really exploitable by the right team, by a smart coach with the right personnel. But I think, like, if you have somebody who's as big as McFarland is, he's pretty agile. He's really long. I don't have his wingspan measurements, but especially like this year, Kelvin really toyed around with lineups like Arsenault at the 4 and Jarace at the 5, to a lesser degree, but a lot of it was toying around with smaller lineups, 4-guard lineups with one big who could really cover all that ground defensively. And I think that that's something that you want more from McFarland. A lot of his, high school tape is him playing that kind of role. And I think he moves well within the paint, like in tight spaces. He gets around guys pretty well. And I think that's kind of the theme here, is having options. We'll talk about the next big they got, but the 3 bigs that they added in this recruiting class are all very different looks, as far as big men go. But I can see a world where they try to use McFarland as like as like a hedge guy, and it could go well, but especially after a few years, I don't know how much he's going to play year one. But I think they're mostly have him around, try out new stuff, use him as a different kind of big, hopefully.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I would guess both McFarland and I hope I'm saying this right. It's spelled Cedric Lath, but I feel like it's Lat, like Cedric Lath. So I'm going to say it like that, but if I'm wrong, absolutely my apologies. But I would imagine both those two red shirt. I just don't see a need for them on the like to play immediately with. They're the type of players who, if one of them doesn't red shirt, that's probably the one who's less valued. Like we've seen that before. WSU's done that with certain players where it's like, we're actually going to redshirt the one who we care more about and want to be a part of our team for longer. And we'll use the one in sparing minutes who, is probably less good, but, is at least fine enough to contribute. Lat is really interesting. If you look him up on YouTube, the first video is he dunks like Shaq. And I was like, oh, that's an exaggeration. And then he actually did dunk like Shaq in that video. So like, very cool. He's the type of dude who just like, you can just tell whenever you watch him, just brings energy. He's just big, thick, he's listed at 6'10", or no, he's listed at 6'9". Okay, that's about right. Sort of undersized height-wise, but very just big and bulky and type of guy who can push someone around a little bit. Seems raw. Seems like the type of guy who's going to take some time to develop, and it worries me that I don't think he's like an uber athlete by any means. Like, he's kind of slow running the floor, very slow getting up off the ground. But there's, Sampson has had success like just getting these big guys in and teaching them how to run, like make these simple reads in an offense and go from there. Like I think, Awan Roberts is a good example of that, where it's like Awan Roberts has like 2 moves in the post, but he's thick and he can just kind of push guys around and gets rebounds and, tries hard. I think Lath can probably do that long term. He's, probably not quite as bouncy as Roberts, but that also could be because he just hasn't been exposed to, an NCAA caliber weight room. Like he's a public school kid, if I believe, and he's not someone who, is super on the radar. But at the same time, you look through his offers, and you're like, okay, this is a kid who, clearly has some intrigue. BYU, Texas, TCU, UCLA. How serious were some of those? It's hard to say, but teams who know what they're doing were in on him. And I think, again, he's just thick. He can do stuff on offense. Give it time. Maybe he's like a sneaky, really high upside swing out of this group. And it's nice to have a guy who every time he dunks tries to shake the rim as hard as possible. Like literally in all his clips where he dunks, he like does like 4 little like pushes like on the rim where he's just like moving his whole body, and it's impossible to not love that energy from a big guy.
Yeah, lots to be excited about with this freshman class. Lots of big men, Kordelius, Jefferson, pretty interesting guard wing. But now we will move into the big news of the last few days for the Cougs. Their transfer acquisitions, who they snagged in the transfer portal. We'll start off. We'll flip the script here a little bit. But we'll start off with the guy who came in first. Temple transfer Damien Dunn. Kind of known for last year being the leader of the team that was the only conference loss for the Cougs until the conference championship. But I mean, led that Temple game. Just is a really tough 6'5" scorer. Can defend. Can make some reads. Isn't crazy turnover prone. He's got good size. He's listed on BART as a sophomore last year, even though it's his 4th year. So it's a little bit confusing. I don't really understand his eligibility, but I guess this will be his junior year.
He still has 3 years of eligibility, I believe.
What I get, he gets to the free throw line. He's a great free throw shooter. I think for his career, he's up over 80%. I don't think the 3-point percentage is there, but he had his best year from behind the line last year, shooting nearly 35%. I think he's just the kind of guy who, you want to bring in, can play in Kelvin's system, is really tough, is a good defender, great scorer. Bryce, what do you think about this acquisition, and what role do you think he's going to play for this team next year?
Well, I think the role is really easy to point out because go back 2 years ago and watch Kyler Edwards. I think that's exactly what they're going to expect with Damien Dunn. He's not quite he's not known as the shooter that Edwards was, but that 35% was on 4.5 attempts a game. Fairly difficult attempts. Like he was a guy for Temple. There's some injury concerns there, I believe, and every time I watched Temple, he just had to take a ton of tough shots, but it is notable. I mean, he got to the line, almost 6 times a game, or he took almost 6 free throws, I should say, which is a lot. Like he has a good feel for kind of getting into the lane and getting fouled. He's pretty athletic. He's not like a very good passer, from what I've seen. Like the 3 assists to 2.8 turnovers. I think a lot of that is just like he'll pass when he has to, and lots of times there's no open passes when he's picked up the ball. But you play him off someone like Shead, I think he can space the floor. I think he can attack and close out. I think he can occasionally be the guy who you're like, get us an ISO bucket. Like, is he as good as someone like a Sasser? No, he's not. Or a Tramon Mark in that way. But like, I think he can be asked to fill the role of a Kyler Edwards, of a Tramon Mark, as like that second or third scorer who brings a lot defensively. He's not that point. He's not a great point of attack defender, but he is a solid help defender, I think. Even though the playmaking stats on defense are pretty poor, I think a lot of that's more Temple than him. I think Temple is just not a great defensive system for stuff like that. but I think he can fit in and do things well. I'm interested to see if he starts because I don't know. I don't know if I'd start him, or if I did, I wouldn't start the next transfer we'll talk about. But that's kind of a tale as we go along.
Yeah, I really like Dunn. I think, like you said, the wing defense, I think that's kind of going to be his role more so, where he'll be able to play to his strengths, where he was more of a point guard for Temple, especially down the stretch of games. Even, playing with Khalif Battle, he was the guy taking shots down the stretch. He's just tough. We'll see if he starts, and we'll talk about that in a second. But we'll move on to the slightly bigger name transfer, I would say. And the Cougs got LJ Cryer from Baylor, 6'1", kind of the prototypical Baylor guard. He's a really solid shooter, really efficient. Didn't get to the line a ton, but nearly 90% from the free throw line. Only missed 7 free throws out of his 66 attempts. 41.5% from the 3-point line. Only 41% of those, or 80% of those were assisted. I can't read, but he's a Baylor guard. He can make certain reads, he can make certain passes, but at the end of the day, his job is to go out there, shoot the piss out of the ball, and he did that job really well. Didn't have any dunk attempts, and only had an 18.3 free throw rate. So he's not really getting into the paint doing much of that, but I think he can really shoot. Bryce, you are way more of a shooting specialist than I am. So what do you think of his shot, and what do you think of his role and potential fit with this Cougs team?
He can really shoot. He'll take him off the dribble. If you go under a screen, he'll bomb away. He can take like some step backs. I would say like I don't think he is. I don't know. I don't think he's like the level of shot creator that like a Sasser is, because I really don't like Cryer as a downhill driver. And I think his passing is pretty bad versus I think Sasser's was good. Just his role wasn't really to pass. But like I think Cryer makes a lot of sense as a shooter off the ball, and then you give him the ball and let him cook a little bit. He can really run like if it's just to create himself a shot. Like he sets up screens well. It's so weird because it's not an archetype I usually like, but it's undeniable to me that Cryer is very good in that archetype. I mean, you look at his numbers. Almost all these are off the dribble. 2 years ago, he took 5.8 threes a game and shot 46.8%. A lot of those off the dribble, like I said, a lot of those self-created. Last year, 6.2 attempts per game, 41.5% from three. It's impossible to lie. It's impossible to deny those numbers. He takes a lot of tough shots and makes them, and there's value to that. I don't love like him as a starter here, mainly because I wouldn't want to play small. But at a certain point, this team might also be desperate for shooting, and he fits in, and he's another guy with 2 years of eligibility left. So that's 2 transfers they grabbed who are probably going to be on this team long term, especially with the new NCAA transfer rule. Dunn and Cryer, neither of them are really NBA prospects, so I wouldn't expect either of them to dip for the league or anything. So that's 2 to 3 years of these guys who are interesting, could fit in. I'm interested to see if they start or if the rotation kind of shakes out a little differently.
Yeah, Cryer a little bit one-dimensional, but I mean, I think he was the best shooter on Baylor last year on a team that had Adam Flagler, who's a good shooter, Keontae George, who's going to be drafted, near the lottery for his shooting. Even some other guys, Langston Love on that team. Cryer can really, really shoot the ball. And you talked about the potential, the starting lineup, how we feel that shakes out. So we'll jump over here to how we feel the starting lineup is going to shake. I think the first question we have to answer is Shed going to return? And if yes, I mean, he's the point guard. There's no way he gets, shaken out of that spot. So, I mean, Shed, and then Roberts is pretty much automatically going to be the 5. He was the 5 for the team last year. He was really, really good, really, really dominant for the first half of the year. He was arguably their best player. Like, he was just an absolute unit. The interesting part is the 2 through 5 guys. And to me, there are like potentially 5 guys who could fit into these 3 spots. And those 5 guys are Cryer, Dunn, Terrence Arsenault, JoJo Tugler,
Sharp.
and Emmanuel Sharp. That's my 5th guy. And so I think if I had to pick who I would put into those spots, I would pick Dunn, I would pick Arsenault, and I would pick Sharp. And then I would have Cryer and Tugler off the bench. Arsenault would be the 4, which I think was his best role last year. I think when he didn't have to dribble, when he could offensive rebound, space the floor, occasionally attack a little closeout, I think that's his best role. Even try and utilize him more as a screener, as a roller, utilize his passing almost in a way like Jarace's, where he doesn't, but you have him actually set the screen, you have him roll, you see what the short roll passing is like, because he's a good interior passer, especially if you have a guy like Roberts there who can catch lobs, who can have post moves. I think that's a really underrated skill of Arsenault's. I think him and Dunn are the 2 that I feel really strongly about starting there. And then I think Sharp has really just kind of earned this spot. I think he's a really elite shooter. I think the defenses got better last year. And I think he can do some of what you got from Marcus Sasser. I think he's just better getting downhill and into the paint than Cryer. And I think that's more of what this team needs, even if he's not that level of shooter. Bryce, what do you think? What would you want the starting lineup to be? And what do you think it will actually be next year?
It's really tough for me to say what it would actually be. I mean, I've watched almost all the Houston games, but you have more exposure. You probably have a few more connections within the team itself. I think for me, I get where you're coming from with Sharp. I really like Sharp. I worry that he's maybe a beneficiary of a hot stretch last year in terms of like how he sits in your mind. I think his total season stats were mostly pretty rough. I mean, 54.8% true shooting isn't awful, but he's not really a passer. I would probably, I know I just said I probably wouldn't start next to each other, but now that I'm kind of thinking about it, I probably would start Cryer and Dunn together, because I think of the way that Sampson likes to run things, and I just think like that duo makes sense. You know, you have Cryer as like this spacer who I like. The defense for me is really TBD with him because he played in a no middle, and he did a lot of kind of the fake no middle stuff really well. But how does that actually translate to a slightly more real defensive scheme that that Houston likes to play? But if he can defend at a consummate level, I think actually playing 2 guards, especially in the AAC, makes sense. And kind of have 2 guys who can both space the floor, attack a closeout, and create for themselves a little bit at the 2 and 3. Kind of gives Shed a little bit more room, which I think is huge. And I don't think you sacrifice so much defensively. Like, I don't think Sharp is so much better than Cryer. Maybe in certain matchups he is, but in general, that I think it matters. What I will say is there is a world to me where Tugler is good enough that you want to go one of Dunn or Cryer, and then Arsenault, Tugler, and then Roberts. I think that is maybe like my one exception to that, like that I could see is because there's a world where Tugler is that good. He's already that good of a defender. The question is, the level at which he can contribute his freshman year is going to depend on what the jumper looks like and how developed he is as a passer. Can he, you mentioned short roll with Arsenault, excuse me. I think you're absolutely right there. Can Tugler do that? Can he get on the short roll and make a good interior pass? Or is he, at least athletic enough to just stand at the dunker spot and be effective there? Does he have a couple post moves? His game developed really nicely over the course of his high school career. Like there were times with I'm blanking on the name of that AAU team. Houston, is it Select? Houston All-Stars.
Is it Houston?
The UIBL Hoops. Houston, yeah, I think it's Houston Hoops or something like that. Anyways, by the end of that, he played with Amir Ali. That's the guy who stands out to me that he played with. He could bring the ball up a little bit. He could put someone in the mix, hit like a nice little spin move. It's not great. It's not super developed, but there is something there. So if that's to a consummate level, I would like to see him start, because I think at that point you're talking about is this team the best defense in the country? If you could start Shed, who's a very good point of attack defender, Dunn, who is good but not great, but then you have Arsenal, who's great. You have Tugler, who's great, and you have Roberts, who's great. All of a sudden, you're talking about just a monster defense that is just going to wear teams down and be really tough to play against. And the spacing might be a little worse because even if Tugler can hit open shots, he's not the shooter that like a Cryer is, obviously. But I still think that's worth it if you could figure out how to make that work. But in general, I would probably guess, and I think probably the highest, maybe not the highest upside, but the highest floor, the best median outcome starting lineup would be Shed, Cryer, Dunn, Arsenault, and Roberts. And then you kind of have guys off the bench like Sharp and Tugler playing big minutes, and then a guy like Ramon Walker kind of being more of a break in case of emergency type guy. Maybe there's probably someone else I'm forgetting. But I will say, too, I do have, like, I would say that Jefferson probably plays a little bit. And I also do wonder, are they going to run Cryer at backup point guard and ask him to play make more? Because there's really not another guy on this roster who seems like an obvious player to do that. Am I missing anyone, Coop? Again, you're more familiar with this team than me.
As far as playmaking goes, no. I think Cryer might be our second best playmaker, even though I think it would be Arsenault, honestly, which is kind of why I want him to play that 4 and be the big, because that's really the only way that you can get him engaged as a passer, because he can't dribble, right? You have to get him going downhill with somebody else doing something. The one guy you're forgetting rotation-wise is Javier Francis, and I think that is the guy who, the other big, I think your big man rotation, to me, ideally, is Arsenault the 4, the starting 4, Roberts the 5, and then JoJo the backup 4, and then Javier the backup 5. I think Javier really showed a lot, and something that's, we talked about this on an earlier, on the first episode we did, the original NCAA Prospect Watch pod that we stole this banner from. But his stats profile is absolutely fucking bonkers. 14.7 block rate. There was a period of time where he was averaging 13 minutes a game and over 2 blocks a game. It was only a few games, but it was still pretty crazy. 16.1 offensive rebound rate, 22.1 defensive rebound rate. Just 33 dunks on the year, despite only playing a quarter of the potential minutes in the Cougs season. Like, just a machine. Like an absolute machine. And, he fouled a lot, but he hustled. He gave a lot of effort. And I'm a big fan of Javier, and I really hope that he gets a bigger role this upcoming season. Because I think he earned it last year, but he got it kind of taken away as, the year kind of got weirder. And, we trust Reggie Chaney more, and, we're in a lot more tight spots than we anticipated being in. But I really like Javier. Now we'll move into the fun kind of fantasy part of this pod, and we'll be looking at a few transfers who we would like the Cougs to look at and try and grab. Some of the more fun potential ones. It's kind of tough because every single Cougs scholarship spot is taken at the moment, so there's not a whole lot that could be done. But if you have to kick somebody who's not very good off a scholarship to get some of these guys, I think you do it, especially the last 2 guys we'll talk about here. So we'll start with Johan Traore, who transferred from one of the SEC schools. This is embarrassing me. Auburn. Yeah, I get Auburn and LSU confused because I don't know why, but especially with their teams this year.
SEC basketball.
Yeah. No, it's not the Big Ten, but the bottom of the SEC is pretty comparable. But Traore he was kind of connected to the Cougs preseason, especially as a recruit, and that's kind of why his name has been tagged here. So Bryce, what do you think of Traore? What did you think of his season, and what would you think of him potentially on the Cougs next year?
What I'll say with Traore is that I've just never really got it. It seems like his like most translatable skill was mid-range scoring, which he's 6'10", he's a good athlete. He can make like some plays in that mid-range area, but I wouldn't call him like a plus passer or a plus ball handler or a plus defender, really. I've just never really got it with him. It feels like the transfer from Auburn is honestly maybe not entirely his choice, if I were to guess, because I'm wondering if he kind of walked through the door and they were like, yeah, well, actually, I don't really see it. Let's not say that he couldn't be good at Houston, because he absolutely could be. I think as a backup big, he makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure he wants to be a backup big, and I'm personally not sure that I would waste like a ton of resources on Traore. I would rather get some of the guys we're going to talk about, especially because we've talked about kind of positional needs here. You have Javier, you have Jawan, or Iwan, sorry, and you also have Tugler, who can play the 5. You have these 2 other freshmen coming in who you don't have to redshirt. You could probably place them in, especially. I'm interested. Now that we've talked about it, I'm interested in the big guy. But like you could probably figure out the 5. I personally would just not be super interested in putting a ton in that basket. What I will say is really interesting is that, as I'm looking through it, I've not seen any team linked with Traore. I don't know how like highly touted he is. He was a 5-star recruit, but it just seems like the market is just not there. And it probably says something again that he didn't play like at all as a freshman and as a 5-star on a team that didn't need like a ton of forward help, but he could have broke into that rotation if he was legit enough.
Yeah, he had a really weak freshman season. I was kind of interested in him as a name last year, just like, let's get more 5 stars, yay! But every single minute I watched him play, just kind of a letdown. And I would honestly just rather see McFarland or Lath or JoJo, or like if you bring him in, you're like, is he going to take Javier minutes? Because I don't think he's better than Javier, and I don't think there's even like a chance he is. Right. So just not somebody I would want to bring in, but I've seen a lot of everybody that's talked about him has linked him to the Cougs because, he was tied to them in recruiting. So now we'll move on to the 2 more interesting names who I think we're both massive, massive fans of. We'll start, of course, with Alabama transfer Jaden Bradley. He's like 6'3", had a little bit of an up and down year last year, playing for an Alabama team that was the number 1 ranked team in the tournament. He ended up eventually losing his spot to Javon Quinterly, the super senior Jelly Fam member. But I'm a massive, massive fan of Bradley. We did an Alabama pod last year talking about their freshmen. And going in, I think we both liked Bradley more than we liked Brandon Miller. Just had a really good season at IMG. Was probably their second best player behind Jarace. And he was like really solid in his minutes. His efficiency wasn't great, only a 48.5% true shooting. But, there were games where he just exploded. He had, 18 points against Gonzaga, 12 against Auburn, 14 against Tennessee. He was just very up and down. But the passing wasn't. 27 assist rate is pretty solid, even if the turnovers were also really high. I think the eye test really popped more than the stats did. And Bryce, what do you think about Bradley, and how would you like to see him here in Houston?
Bradley, definitely makes the most sense as, if Shed doesn't come back, right? Like he is the closest thing to Jamal Shed outside of Jamal Shed in college basketball. And there's a lot of value to that. And I mean this as no disrespect to our boy. He has a higher upside than Shed, offensively at the very least. He gets to the rim whenever he wants. And obviously some of that was Alabama's, very good spacing, but I think he can do it in tighter spaces too. The handle's legit. The athleticism is legit. He gets to the line. He makes plays. He's a potentially very good passer. I honestly wonder sometimes if his passing was almost limited by Alabama's kind of, stringent kind of how they run plays. There's a lot of transition stuff, and I think in the half court, like his passing could pop even more. Like it's hard sometimes to make like a ton of like standout passes when you're just in like the most obvious offensive scheme imaginable that other teams just straight up can't defend because they don't know how to defend 3 shooters. And he was great at executing. I think he's a super high upside guy. I have no idea what he's looking for. I imagine Alabama would have loved to have him back. Again, he lost his starting spot. I don't know if, some stuff might get brought up that he was technically in the car with Brandon Miller when that, thing went down, whatever. Maybe that has something to do with it. I have no idea. I have no idea why he's leaving Alabama because it seems like a perfect situation, and it seems like if they're smart, they would want him back. Though, again, Alabama has been linked to a ton of point guards in the portal. If you look up a point guard who you think is pretty good, Alabama's probably been linked to him. So there's some worry there, but I honestly think if you could get Bradley here, it would be the biggest portal guy you'll get. To me, he's better than Cryer or Dunn, or Trey or whoever. He's really, really good, and he's the type of guy who could immediately come in and help this team maintain their 1 seed status.
Yeah, we lots of good things to say about Bradley. Just plays basketball the right way. Not too much more to say about Jaden Bradley. And the last guy we'll talk about, and the last thing we'll hit on before getting out of here, is the guy who announced his portal entry this morning, Matt Cleveland from Florida State. Somebody Bryce and I have loved for the last few years at the very least. 6'5", wingy player who really evolved offensively last year. FSU had a really disappointing year. I think that's the only real way to put it. But I think Cleveland was really nice. He showed a lot of improvement. He shot the ball well from 3, shot the ball better from the free throw line, kept his fouls down, and really rebounded the ball and flourished into more of a pull-up shooter and a creator for others. He ran some more secondary pick and roll. Bryce, what do you think about Cleveland, and what do you think about his fit here with the Cougs?
If Houston just wants to run the dirtiest defense imaginable, they should go after Cleveland. And then you definitely start Tugler, and you just go Cleveland at 2, Shed at the 1, Cleveland at the 2, Arsenault, Tugler, Roberts. Have fun scoring. The offense might be bloody and messy and hard to watch at times, but that defense is disgusting. The length, the athleticism. The worry with Cleveland is the shot, right? It's just inconsistent. This was a thing in high school as well. Can he shoot? And he's also I would say probably a little bit over aggressive defensively. I love the defense, but he kind of struggled to rein it in at times, which is, under Florida State's usually good at that. So for him to be that out of base sometimes, even at Florida State, maybe there's a worry there, but I think it's worth the risk. He can potentially, shot create. He showed a lot of dribble pull-up stuff in high school. Very athletic, can get to the rims, good cutter. I love the fit. Maybe there's a thought he's a little redundant with Arsenault, but again, I'm one of those guys who it's just give me all the long, lanky defenders imaginable, and I'll figure the rest out. Especially if you have a point guard like Shed, you have a guy like Roberts who can clean things up. It could be an elite defense, elite offensive rebounding team. Cobble together the shooting, and I think that's very fun, very ugly in the best imaginable way. So I'd be all in on that type of group.
I'm just imagining the rebounding that comes from a Cleveland, Arsenault, Tugler, and Roberts lineup. Those are 4 guys who are all slightly undersized, but elite motors, elite rebounders for their positions. I think that would be the greatest offensive rebounding team of all time in college basketball. I don't think there is another team that has 4 guys who are that big, that athletic, that high of a motor. Then you still have Shed, who's still a good rebounder, despite the fact that he's 5'10". So I would love to see Cleveland. Big fan of his. I think he's potentially draftable. Hope within the next few years. But we shall see. And with that, thank you so much for joining us for the Cougs season breakdown. As any more Cougs news happens this offseason, I'll hopefully hop on with the other Chop Shop guys. I'll be hopping on more for draft stuff. The more draft stuff that happens, with the Rockets, I'll bring Bryce on. He's the best in the business. One of my best friends in the whole world. And I loved having you on. Bryce, where can people find you? What have you been up to? Just, go ham.
Yeah, well, all my stuff is easy to find. Follow me on Twitter at BryceHendrick14. But just listen to Upside Swings. That's the big thing I'm doing. Just listen to the podcast. Shout out to Coop. Shout out to the guys at Chop Shop. Support independent media like this. I think it's so important. I'm a big fan, and down to come on anytime.
Yeah, listen to the Upside Swings NBA Draft Podcast, the podcast with the highest ceiling. If you want more breakdowns of every single draft prospect imaginable. But we'll be on here talking about, guys for the Rockets as the draft comes closer and, as other stuff starts wrapping up for the Rockets. So thank you so much for listening, guys. I hope you have a good one. Let us know your thoughts down below.